At Christmas dinner last year, my 6-year-old daughter looked across the table at my father-in-law and asked the question that changed everything. She had been coloring on the back of an envelope, one of those kids at the table moments where you assume they're not listening, and then she looked up with that complete innocence that only children have and said, "Why does Daddy have the deed to the lake house if you said it was yours?" The room stopped. My father-in-law, Bernard Ackefer, opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He didn't yell at her, didn't deflect, didn't laugh it off the way he laughed off everything else. He stood up slowly, pushed his chair back like he needed the weight of that action to hold himself upright, and walked to the kitchen. 30 minutes later, the police arrived. And they did not come for me. I have been called a lot of things since that night. Cold, calculating, someone who used her own child as a weapon. I want to be very clear. My daughter said what she said because children pay attention, because she had seen the document on my husband's desk and asked me what it meant, and because I told her the truth in the simplest way I could. What happened after that was not my doing. It was Bernard's. Every single consequence that followed was built by his own hands, over years, brick by careful brick. I just stopped standing in front of what he'd built. To understand that dinner, you need to understand the Ackefer family, and to understand the Ackefer family, you need to understand Bernard. My husband, Daniel Ackefer, is the second of three sons. His father, Bernard, built a small commercial real estate portfolio in the late 90s, two strip malls, a storage facility, and the lake house in Cedar Ridge, which was never a rental property and never part of the business. The lake house was personal. Bernard talked about it the way some men talk about a boat or a first car. It was his. It had always been his. It was going to stay his. He said that approximately every time we visited it, which was 4 times a year, and he said it in the way that people say things when they're not actually talking about the thing they're talking about. He wasn't describing a house. He was describing territory. My name is Nora Scott. I kept my name when Daniel and I married 8 years ago, which Bernard took as a personal slight and mentioned exactly twice before Daniel asked him not to mention it again. I am 39 years old. I work in commercial property acquisitions, which is either a remarkable coincidence or, depending on your perspective, the universe's idea of a setup. I had been doing this work for 11 years by the time of that Christmas dinner. I was not new to it. I was not a hobbyist. I had closed transactions that Bernard's entire portfolio wouldn't cover in a single year, and I had done it quietly, without announcement, without the kind of flag planting that Bernard treated as evidence of a person's worth. My relationship with the Ackefer family, from the beginning, was a study in polite condescension delivered with impeccable manners. Bernard's wife, Helen, is not a cruel woman. I want to be clear about that because it matters later. Helen is a woman who learned very early that Bernard's version of events was the version that kept the household functional, and she had spent 40 years making peace with that arrangement. She is warm, she makes incredible food, and she looks at her husband before she answers most questions, even the ones that have nothing to do with him. That look, the quick sideways check, is her signature tell. She does it when she's uncertain, when she's about to say something she isn't fully sure Bernard would approve of, and sometimes just when someone says something she isn't ready to have an opinion about yet. I noticed it within the first two dinners. I never said anything. The condescension from Bernard was never loud. That was the thing about it. He didn't dismiss me with volume. He dismissed me with timing, the way he'd finish a sentence someone else had started, the way he'd reframe my comments as Daniel's ideas, the way he'd ask me about my work with the specific tone of someone asking a child what they wanted to be when they grew up. Still doing the property thing? He asked me at Thanksgiving 4 years ago. I had just closed on a mixed-use development in the Northeast Corridor worth $420,000 in commission alone. Still doing the property thing was what he said. I smiled and said yes. His oldest son, Gregory Ackefer, is largely a copy of his father with less patience. Gregory married a woman named Vivienne, who does not like me for reasons that have never been stated directly, but have been implied through 11 different variations of the phrase, "We just want everyone to be happy." Gregory manages two of the three commercial properties in Bernard's portfolio, receives a salary for doing so, and has spent the better part of the last decade positioning himself as the logical heir to everything Bernard has ever owned or touched. He talks about the future of the family assets the way a dog watches a steak. He is not subtle. What he is, however, is extremely careful about what he says in front of people who might quote him back later. The youngest son, Marcus, not my husband, does not live nearby. He moved to Vancouver 6 years ago, married a woman named Sira, who the family refers to as very nice in a tone that contains multitudes, and visits twice a year at most. He is the person in this story who does not factor much into what happened, except in one moment near the end, which I'll get to. Daniel is different from his brothers. I knew that when I married him, and I have continued knowing it through 8 years of evidence. He is not weak, that's not what I mean. He is the kind of person who believes that most conflicts can be resolved through conversation, which is a beautiful quality in a partner, and a complicated one when your father is Bernard Achafer. Daniel has spent most of his adult life navigating between his own instincts and his loyalty to a family structure that was not always worthy of it. He loves his father. He knows his father. Those two things have existed in tension for as long as I've known him. Our daughter Lily turned 6 in October. She is loud, funny, occasionally exhausting, and pays attention to everything with the focused intensity of a very small investigator. She started at Cedar Ridge Elementary in September and had by December already befriended approximately half her class and memorized the names of every staff member she encountered. She is the kind of child who asks every question she has immediately, without filtering for audience or occasion. I love this about her. I have loved this about her since she was old enough to form questions. On the night in question, her specific, unfiltered question was the thing that set the last domino falling in a chain Bernard had started building before Lily was born. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how we got there. The first time I understood that something was wrong with the lake house specifically, not just with Bernard's general architecture of control, but with the house itself, was 3 years ago in the spring. Daniel came home from a Sunday lunch with his father carrying the particular silence he carries when something has bothered him that he isn't ready to process out loud yet. He made tea he didn't drink. He sat at the kitchen table. Eventually, I sat down across from him and waited. He wants to restructure how the house is held, Daniel said finally. I kept my face neutral. What does that mean? He said something about estate planning, simplifying things. He picked up the mug, put it down. He wants to transfer it out of the family trust into a direct ownership structure. He asked me to sign something. Did you sign it? He looked at me. I told him I needed to look it over. That was the first signal. Not an alarm, not yet, but the kind of low frequency hum that a person in my profession learns to take seriously. Because here is what I knew that Daniel had not yet pieced together. The lake house had been in the Achafer family trust for over 2 decades. Moving it out of the trust and into a direct ownership structure was not simplification. It was, depending on the specifics, either a tax maneuver or a control maneuver, and in my experience, those two things were not mutually exclusive. I didn't say any of that to Daniel that night. I asked him to bring home the document the next time he saw his father, and I asked him to do it casually, without making it a point of tension. He did. 2 weeks later, he left it on my desk. I sat down that evening after Lily was in bed and went through it carefully, and what I found was not simplification. What I found was a proposed transfer structure that would have moved the lake house into sole ownership under Bernard's name, removing it from the trust entirely, and in doing so, removing Daniel's inherited interest in it, which had been clearly named in the original trust documents drafted when Daniel was 19 years old. I went through it twice. Then I called my attorney. Her name is Deanna Furusawa, and she has been my attorney in both professional and personal matters for 6 years. I found her through a referral from a colleague when I needed contract review on my first independent acquisition, and I have kept her because she is precise, calm, and does not waste words. I called her at 9:15 on a Wednesday evening, which she answered because she knew my number and because we have that kind of professional relationship. I told her what I'd found. She asked me to scan and send the document. I did. She called me back the next morning. This would have eliminated Daniel's interest, she said. The trust document from 20 years ago names him clearly. If he had signed this, it would have been very difficult to untangle later. Can Bernard do this legally? He can try, she said, but not without Daniel's consent and not without going through proper estate procedure. This document, as drafted, would not have held up. But it would have muddied the water enough to cause real problems if anyone tried to enforce Daniel's original interest later. Someone was betting on Daniel not looking closely. I thanked her and told her I would be in touch. I didn't tell Daniel everything I'd learned, not immediately. What I told him was this: don't sign anything from your father related to property without running it by me first. He agreed. He thought I was being professionally cautious. I was being professionally cautious, but I was also beginning to understand the shape of something much larger. If you have ever been counted out by someone who should have known better, you know exactly what that silence feels like, the moment you understand the full scope of what someone assumed about you, and you decide, quietly and completely, not to correct them yet. Over the next 18 months, I did 3 things that I did not announce to the Achafer family or to most people I knew. The first thing I did was consult with Deanna more formally. In February of that year, on the 14th, I remember the date because Daniel made dinner, and I told him I had a late work call, which was technically true. I sat in Deanna's office for 2 hours, and we reviewed the original Ackaffer family trust in full detail. Deanna had obtained a copy through public records and through Daniel's consent to share trust documents relevant to his interest. What we found, taken together, confirmed what I had suspected. The lake house had been named specifically in the trust as an asset to be divided equally among the three Ackaffer sons upon Bernard's passing, or upon Bernard's decision to distribute during his lifetime. But any distribution required the consent of all named beneficiaries, which included Daniel and Marcus. Gregory was named as co-executor, not as a beneficiary, which was a distinction Bernard had apparently never made clear to Gregory himself, or had made very clear, depending on your interpretation of how Bernard operated. The second thing I did was begin quietly building a file, not dramatically, not with the energy of someone planning a confrontation, with the methodical patience of someone who works in acquisitions for a living and understands that documentation is everything. I requested and received certified copies of the trust documents. I noted, with dates and timestamps, every conversation in which Bernard made a reference to the lake house as solely his. I kept Daniel's original proposed signature document in a locked drawer. I documented, in writing sent to Deanna via secure email, every significant development as it occurred. The third thing I did was establish a college fund for Lily. I had been meaning to do this since she was born, and the events of the preceding months gave the project a new weight. I worked with a financial advisor named Tomás Guerrero, who had managed my personal accounts for 4 years, and in March of that year, we opened a 529 account for Lily with an initial deposit of $65,000 drawn from my own earnings, not from any joint account with Daniel, not from anything tied to either of our families. It was mine. It went to her. It had been growing since March, untouched, which meant it was also untouchable by anyone who might one day attempt to leverage Lily's financial well-being as a point of pressure. I am telling you about this because it mattered later in a way I will explain, and because the decision to make it formally independent was not accidental. The Ackaffer family did not know any of this. They knew I was still doing the property thing. They knew Lily was in school and doing well. They knew Daniel and I came to Sunday lunches and Christmas dinners and birthday gatherings, and sat at Bernard's table and ate Helen's food, and listened to Gregory talk about the commercial portfolio as though he were managing a sovereign nation. They did not know what I knew. They did not know what I had built, or what I had documented, or what Deanna had filed on my behalf in a preliminary capacity, waiting for the appropriate moment. The appropriate moment was accelerating toward me faster than I had anticipated. In October, 2 months before the Christmas dinner, something changed. I was in my home office on a Tuesday afternoon when Daniel appeared in the doorway holding his phone with the expression he gets when something has landed that he hasn't categorized yet. He said his father had called. He said his father wanted to meet for lunch, just the two of them, to talk about the property situation. Daniel used air quotes when he said the property situation, which told me he knew something specific was coming, even if he didn't know the shape of it. Did he say what specifically? I asked. He said he'd made some decisions about the estate and he wanted to talk to me before he involved the lawyers. Before he involved the lawyers. I held that phrase for a moment and set my pen down. Tell him yes, I said. Go, call me after. Daniel went to lunch with his father. He called me from the parking lot of the restaurant 2 hours later, and his voice had that flat, careful quality it gets when he is working very hard to be measured. He told me he's updated his estate documents, Daniel said. He says the lake house is going to Gregory. He's already had it transferred. I let the silence sit for exactly 2 seconds. Already transferred, I said. That's what he said, done. He said it was always going to go to Gregory because Gregory is the one managing the business, and it makes sense for the assets to stay consolidated. He paused. He said he talked to Marcus. Marcus apparently agreed. Marcus signed something? Dad says Marcus signed a relinquishment. I took one slow breath. Daniel, I need you to come home, and I need you to not call your father back before we talk. He came home. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he had sat with his untouched tea 3 years earlier, and I told him everything I had not told him up to that point. I watched his face process it in stages. The trust document, Deanna's analysis, the file I had been building, the preliminary filings. He is not a man who shows emotion loudly, but there is a specific stillness that comes over him when something genuinely surprises him, a kind of internal recalibration, and I watched it happen in real time. You've known for 3 years, he said. I suspected for 3 years. I confirmed it over 18 months. And you didn't tell me? I met his eyes. I was waiting until we had something solid enough to act on, not just something that would blow up a family dinner and disappear. He sat with that, then he said, "What did they actually transfer? What's the legal situation?" "That's what we need to find out. Tomorrow morning I am calling Deanna. I would like you to be on that call." He nodded, very slowly, and then he said something that told me we were on the same side of this completely. If Marcus signed something he didn't understand, or was pressured into signing, that matters. "It does," I said. "We're going to find out exactly what he signed." We called Deanna the next morning. What she found, after 2 days of review, was this. The transfer Bernard had described had been filed, but it had been filed on the basis of a document that required all three sons' consent and Marcus's signed relinquishment, which Bernard had presented as straightforward, contained language that a native English speaker who had been living in Vancouver for 6 years and trusted his father completely might have signed without fully understanding. It was not forgery. It was something subtler and in some ways worse. It was pressure dressed as paperwork. Deanna told us she could challenge it. She told us the timeline was important. We were still inside the window where a formal challenge could be filed before the transfer was fully recorded in the county system. "How long do we have?" I asked. If Bernard filed when he said he did, approximately 6 weeks, possibly 8. Christmas dinner was 5 weeks away. I called Marcus in Vancouver that same evening. I had spoken to Marcus perhaps a dozen times in the years of my marriage, to Daniel, pleasant, surface level conversations, the kind you have with a family member you like but don't know. This conversation was different. I told him what Daniel and I had found. I told him what Deanna had analyzed about his relinquishment. I told him that if he had signed under circumstances he hadn't fully understood, there were options. There was a long pause on the line from Vancouver. "I asked Dad twice what the document meant," Marcus said. "He told me it was a formality, that the house was going to Gregory anyway because of the business structure and I was just making it official. Was anyone else present when you signed?" "Vivienne was there, Gregory's wife, of course." "Marcus," I said, "I need to ask you something directly. Did you want the house to go to Gregory?" Another long pause. "I wanted it to go where Dad said it was supposed to go," he said. I didn't know Daniel had an interest too. Dad didn't mention that. I told him to call Deanna. I gave him her number. I told him not to call his father before speaking with her. He agreed, and I believed him, because Marcus has always struck me as a man who is fundamentally decent and has spent his adult life at a safe geographic distance from his family, precisely because being decent around Bernard required constant maintenance. The next 5 weeks were the most intentional I have ever spent. Daniel and I spoke with Deanna 3 times. Marcus gave a formal statement. The challenge was filed on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks before Christmas. Bernard did not know. Gregory did not know. Helen did not know. We had not told anyone because Deanna had advised us that informing Bernard in advance would give him time to complicate the filing, and because I had spent 3 years learning to move carefully. We accepted the Christmas dinner invitation, as we always did. Lily was excited about the tree and the cousins and Helen's cooking in that order. I helped her pick out a dress. Daniel drove. On the way, I looked out the window at the highway and thought about the 6 weeks it had taken to get here, and the 3 years before that, and the moment at the kitchen table when I had first held that proposed signature document and understood what it was trying to do. I had not planned for what happened at dinner to happen the way it happened. That part, Lily's question, the envelope she had been coloring on, the deed she had seen on Daniel's desk when she wandered into his office looking for tape, that part was entirely her. Children pay attention. They carry things forward without understanding the weight of them, and then they put them down in rooms where the weight suddenly becomes visible to everyone. The close calls in the weeks before Christmas had been numerous and small. Gregory had called Daniel twice to discuss estate matters in a tone that assumed ignorance, and Daniel had deflected both times with a fluency that surprised even me, because Daniel is not, by nature, a person who deflects. He is learning. Vivienne had made a comment at Lily's school pickup. She volunteers in the same building on Thursdays, about how lovely it must be to have your finances in order, while looking at my coat in the particular way that was meant to convey she had priced it. I smiled. I had closed a transaction the week before that had netted more than Gregory's entire annual salary from the commercial portfolio. And I had done it in 3 days because I knew the seller and I knew the market, and I had spent 11 years building the kind of knowledge that Bernard Achafer had spent 40 years assuming I didn't have. Gregory himself had made one direct attempt, 2 Sundays before Christmas, to have a conversation with me that he framed as concern and that I recognized as reconnaissance. We were in Helen's living room after lunch, the kids scattered to the basement playroom, Daniel and Bernard in the kitchen with the football game on low. Gregory sat in the chair across from me and said, with his hands folded in his lap. Nora, I know this estate situation has been confusing. If you have questions, I'm happy to explain how these things work. I looked at him for a moment. He has his father's eyes, dark, steady, accustomed to being believed. That's very kind, I said. Deanna has it covered. A beat. Deanna? My attorney, she's been handling the specifics, I smiled. But thank you. He opened his mouth, closed it, and pulled out his phone with the kind of studied casualness that meant he was texting someone immediately. Vivienne, almost certainly. I picked up my coffee and watched the game through the kitchen doorway, where Bernard was laughing at something Daniel had said. The laugh sounded real. I wondered if he had any idea what had already been filed. He did not. I was certain of it. Because if Bernard Acaffer had known that a formal challenge to the transfer was sitting in the county recorder's office, Christmas dinner would have been a very different kind of event, one where he controlled the agenda. Instead, what happened at Christmas dinner was something none of us had scripted, delivered by a 6-year-old in a green velvet dress who had been coloring on an envelope and simply asked what she wanted to know. And everything that had been built in 3 years of careful, documented, legally supported preparation was about to become visible to everyone in that room, all at once, whether any of us were ready or not. The timing, as I would later tell Deanna, could not have been worse. Or maybe it was exactly right. Lily asked her question at 6:17 in the evening on December 23rd. I know the time because I had glanced at my phone 30 seconds earlier to check whether Deanna had responded to the message I had sent that morning, a brief, careful note telling her to be reachable over the holiday. She had not yet responded. I put the phone face down next to my water glass, picked up my fork, and then my daughter's voice came across the table, clear as a bell, no preamble. Why does Daddy have the deed to the lake house if you said it was yours, Grandpa? She wasn't asking to cause trouble. She wasn't asking because I had put her up to it or coached her or in any way prepared her for this moment. She was asking because she had seen a document on Daniel's desk 2 weeks earlier while looking for tape, had asked Daniel what it was, and Daniel, tired, distracted, not thinking about the audience, had told her it was the paper that said our family owned a house by the lake. She had carried that information with her the way 6-year-olds carry things, completely, without understanding its weight, until the moment it seemed relevant to mention. The timing was not my design. The consequence was not my fault, but I would be lying if I said I wasn't ready for it. Bernard set his fork down, not with force, with the deliberate quiet of a man who needs a second to calculate. He looked at Lily with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not warmth, but a particular blankness that looked like the surface of water just before something large moves underneath it. Lily looked back at him with complete, open expectation. She had asked a question. She was waiting for an answer. That is the entire architecture of a 6-year-old's conversational approach. Helen, at the other end of the table, had gone very still. Her fork was suspended halfway between her plate and her mouth, and she did not complete the motion in either direction. She set it down so quietly the tines didn't make a sound. Gregory, seated to Bernard's left, looked at his father first, then at me, then back at his father. His hand went to his glass of wine and stayed there, not drinking, just gripping. Vivienne looked at her plate. Daniel, beside me, had turned toward Lily with the beginnings of a redirect, the parental instinct to smooth over, to say something light and move the conversation along. I put my hand on his arm under the table. He stopped. Bernard opened his mouth, closed it, then he stood up. Not abruptly, slowly, with the full weight of a man who has made a decision in real time and is acting on it before he has fully thought through the consequences of acting. He pushed his chair back, folded his napkin, set it beside his plate, and walked to the kitchen. Lily watched him go, then she looked at me. Did I say something wrong? No, sweetheart. I smoothed her hair with my hand. You asked a good question. Finish your dinner. She looked at her plate, apparently satisfied, and picked up her fork. Children are remarkable in their capacity to accept incomplete answers when delivered with calm. The table was not calm. Gregory had leaned slightly forward, his elbows on the edge, his wine glass still in his hand. Vivienne's jaw was tight. Helen was looking toward the kitchen doorway with the expression she gets when she is deciding whether to follow Bernard or wait, the quick calculation of 40 years of marriage compressed into 3 seconds. She waited. Daniel looked at me, not with the sideways question of someone who doesn't know what's happening, but with the steady look of someone who has known for 2 months and has been watching the clock ever since. I looked back at him and gave a small nod. He let out a breath through his nose, very quietly, and picked up his fork. We ate in a silence that had a texture to it, the kind that presses against the inside of your ears. Vivienne eventually made a comment about the sweet potatoes. Nobody responded. Gregory refilled his wine without offering to refill anyone else's. Helen excused herself to check on Bernard. She was gone for 4 minutes and came back with an expression that had been carefully reassembled into neutrality, which meant she had found whatever she had found and had decided to hold it. Bernard did not return to the table. 14 minutes after he left, Daniel took Lily to the living room to play with the building set she had found under the tree. I stayed at the table. Gregory looked at me across the empty chairs. What did you tell her? His voice was level, controlled. I didn't tell her anything. She saw the document and asked Daniel what it was. What document? The deed. I picked up my water glass. The corrected one, filed November 18th. The color left his face in a slow, downward movement like a tide going out. He set his wine glass on the table with the careful precision of someone suddenly very aware of their hands. That's not possible, he said. Deanna filed the challenge on October 28th. The county recorder completed the review and issued the corrected deed November 18th. It's a matter of public record, Gregory. You could have found it yourself if you'd looked. Vivienne's head came up. She had been studying the tablecloth and she stopped. Bernard said the transfer was clean, Gregory said, not to me, to the air in front of him, recalibrating. Bernard said a lot of things. I set my glass down, including that Daniel and Marcus had no claim to the lake house, which the trust document from 20 years ago directly contradicts. Deanna had the trust document. The county had both filings. The corrected deed reflects Daniel's inheritance interest, and Marcus's if he chooses to pursue it. Marcus signed something he didn't fully understand, under conditions that Deanna documented. His statement is part of the filing record. Vivienne put her hand on Gregory's arm. He didn't look at her. You planned this, Gregory said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't anger exactly. It was closer to the sound a person makes when they realize they have been playing a game whose rules they didn't know. I planned for what your father was already doing, I said. He made the first move, Gregory. In October of the year before last, he asked Daniel to sign a document that would have surrendered Daniel's interest in the lake house. I found out about it. I hired an attorney. I documented everything that followed. Your father had 2 years to stop. He kept going. The silence that followed lasted long enough to become its own event. Helen, who had been sitting at her end of the table with her hands folded in her lap, spoke without looking at either of us. He's called someone, she said quietly. He's on the phone in the kitchen. Who is he calling? Gregory pushed his chair back. Helen looked at her son with an expression I had never seen from her before, something between exhaustion and resignation. The face of a woman who has watched a version of this scene play out many times in many forms and has run out of the energy required to pretend she hasn't. I don't know, she said. His attorney, I expect. Gregory stood up. He went to the kitchen. I heard his voice, low and quick, and then Bernard's voice, older and slower, and then a silence that meant they had moved to the far side of the kitchen or had lowered themselves below hearing range. I sat at the table with Helen and waited. She looked at me across the wreckage of the Christmas dinner. The candles were still burning. The sweet potatoes were still on the table. Room smelled like food that had gone from celebration to evidence in the space of one child's question. How long have you known? Helen asked. 2 years, she absorbed that. Her hand moved to the base of her wine glass, not gripping it, just resting there. And you waited. I waited until I had enough to make it matter. Yes. She looked at the kitchen doorway. He thought Daniel would never push back. She said it without heat, almost clinically, like a diagnosis she had been sitting with for a long time. He counted on it. I know. Did Daniel know how long you'd been? Since October, I said. When Bernard told him the transfer was done, I told Daniel everything then. She nodded slowly. Then she said something I did not expect. I'm sorry, Nora, for my part in it. She didn't elaborate. She didn't explain what her part had been or how large she considered it. But she said it directly, without the sideways check toward the kitchen, which told me it was real. I looked at her for a moment. Thank you, Helen. The sound of the front door reached us before I processed what it meant, not the heavy slam of someone leaving in anger, but the quick, purposeful movement of a door opened from the outside. I heard voices I didn't recognize. Then Daniel's voice from the living room, sharp with surprise. Then footsteps. 2 officers from the county sheriff's department came through the entryway. They had been called, I learned this later from the report, by Bernard himself. A decision that remains, to me, the most remarkable miscalculation of his entire performance. Bernard had called them to report what he described as fraudulent interference with a property transfer. He had, in other words, called the police to report me. What he had not accounted for was that a call to law enforcement about a property dispute requires those officers to review the public record. And the public record, as of November 18th, showed a corrected deed in Daniel's name, legally filed, reviewed, and recorded. The fraudulent interference Bernard intended to report was, in the county system's documentation, the legitimate inheritance claim. The thing Bernard had called a fraud was, on paper, the truth. The officers spent 31 minutes in the house. I know because I checked my phone when they arrived and again when they left. They spoke with Bernard in the kitchen. They spoke with me in the living room, while Lily sat on the couch 10 feet away building a tower with the blocks Daniel had put in her hands. They looked at the documents I had brought, not because I had planned to bring them to Christmas dinner, specifically, but because Deanna had told me 3 weeks earlier to keep certified copies of the corrected deed in my car at all times until the situation was formally resolved. I had. I retrieved them when the officer asked if I had documentation of the filing. The officer reviewed what I handed him. He reviewed it for longer than I expected. Then he thanked me and went back to speak with his colleague, and I sat down next to Lily and helped her put the red block on top of the blue one without it falling. When they came back through the living room, they did not speak to me again. They went to the kitchen. There was a conversation I could not fully hear. And then they came out through the hallway, and Bernard came with them, not in handcuffs, not under arrest, but accompanied, in the manner of a person who has been firmly and formally asked to come along for a conversation they cannot decline. He passed the living room doorway. He did not look at me or at Lily. His face had the quality of something that has been struck and not yet registered the impact. Gregory was behind him, his phone pressed to his ear, talking in a fast, low voice that was trying to sound controlled and was not succeeding. Vivienne stood in the hallway and watched them go. When the front door closed, she turned and looked at me through the living room doorway, and for the first time in 8 years, her expression contained nothing performed. She looked like a woman who has just realized the house she's been standing in was built on a different foundation than she was told. She said nothing. She went to get her coat. If you're still with me, stay, because what came next was not what Bernard had planned, and it was not fully what I had planned either. It was something more complete than either of us had designed. The following morning, Deanna called me at 8:45. She had been notified of the police contact through the standard channels and had already spoken with the county sheriff's office. Bernard had not been charged the previous night. The officers had documented the contact, reviewed the public filings, and determined that the property dispute was a civil matter, which it was. But what Bernard's call had created, and this was the thing he had not calculated, was a formal record of the dispute, lodged by him, which opened the door to exactly the legal proceeding that Deanna had been preparing to pursue anyway. He handed us the venue, Deanna said, with the particular dryness of a woman who has seen this before. We file for formal estate mediation. His own police report is now evidence of the disputed claim. He tried to report you and created his own paper trail. How long does mediation take? At this asset value, 4 to 6 weeks. I want to move quickly before he has time to further complicate the trust structure. Are you and Daniel available Thursday? We were available Thursday. The mediation took place on January 9th. I will not walk through it step by step, because most of it was the procedural geometry of legal process. Documents presented, documents reviewed, positions stated. A neutral mediator working through the framework of the original trust against the events of the preceding 2 years. What I will tell you is what happened when the mediator placed Bernard's proposed transfer document alongside the original trust document and asked Bernard directly to explain the discrepancy in the consent requirements. Bernard looked at the documents. Then he looked at Gregory, who was seated beside him. Gregory was looking at his attorney. His attorney was making a note on her legal pad and not looking at Gregory. Bernard said, I believed the consent had been obtained. The mediator asked him to clarify what he meant by believed. Bernard said, I was told it was handled. His attorney made another note. Gregory said, very quietly, Dad. Bernard looked at his oldest son. Something moved across his face, not guilt exactly, but the particular look of a man who has built an entire structure on one load-bearing assumption and is watching the assumption fail in real time. He had assumed Daniel would not look closely. He had assumed I was not paying attention. He had assumed that the family hierarchy he had maintained for 40 years was sturdy enough to carry the weight of what he was doing. None of those assumptions had been correct. And in the room where the proof of that was spread across a conference table, he looked, for the first time in the 8 years I had known him, like an old man. I did not feel triumphant. I want to say that clearly. What I felt was a kind of tired clarity, the sensation of having carried something heavy for a long time, and finally setting it down on solid ground. The mediator addressed the consent issue first. Marcus had submitted his statement remotely, along with a declaration that he had not understood the scope of what he signed, and had not been informed that Daniel's interest was also named in the trust. The mediator reviewed this against the transfer document and the original trust provisions. The conclusion took 11 minutes to reach formally and had been visible in the documents for most of the preceding hour. The transfer, as executed, had not met the consent requirements of the trust. It was voidable. And because Bernard had documented the dispute himself by calling law enforcement, the legal record was complete. Gregory's attorney leaned toward Gregory and said something in a very low voice. Gregory listened. He looked at his hands. Then he looked at Bernard. You told me it was settled, Gregory said. His voice had the flat quality of someone who has just understood that they were not, as they believed, a partner in something, they were a vehicle for it. You told me Daniel and Marcus had agreed. Bernard did not answer. Dad. Gregory's voice was not angry. It was something worse than angry. It was the sound of a person realizing they have been used by someone they trusted completely. Did they agree or not? Bernard said, I handled it the way I thought was best for the family. You handled it. Gregory sat back in his chair. He laughed once, a short, involuntary sound with no humor in it, and then stopped. The mediator returned to the formal process. The corrected deed was upheld. Daniel's one-third interest in the lake house, as named in the original trust, was confirmed. Marcus's claim was noted as a separate proceeding, pending his formal decision to pursue it, though the documentation of his involuntary relinquishment made his position strong. Bernard was formally advised that any further attempt to transfer, encumber, or modify the disposition of the lake house without the consent of all named beneficiaries would constitute a breach of the trust terms and expose him to civil liability. The mediator read this conclusion in the level tone of someone who does this for a living. Bernard sat across the table and listened to it, and when it was done, he did not argue. He did not stand up. He sat in his chair with both hands flat on the table, and he looked at the window, not at me, not at Daniel, not at Gregory, at the window, where the January light was thin and gray and offered nothing back. Daniel reached under the table and took my hand. He held it without squeezing. I held it back. In the weeks that followed, the Achafer family reconfigured itself the way families do, after a structure that was load-bearing proves hollow, not all at once, not cleanly, but with the slow, grinding adjustment of people working out what is still standing and what was never real to begin with. Bernard retained his attorney and made no further moves regarding the lake house. The corrected deed stood. His attorney, I was told through Deanna, advised him clearly that any further action would be expensive, losing, and public. He accepted this. He is not a man built for public losing, which meant, in practice, that he accepted it silently and completely. Gregory filed a formal complaint with the estate trustee regarding the manner in which his father had represented the consent situation to him. This was, I thought, the most honest thing Gregory Achafer had done in the years I'd known him, acknowledging, in writing, that he had been misled. His anger at his father was real, and it lasted. The last I heard from Daniel, Gregory, and Bernard had spoken twice in the 4 months since the mediation, and both conversations had been short. Something had broken there that Bernard's version of events had always relied on, Gregory's total belief in the structure his father had built. That belief was gone. I do not know if it will come back. I suspect Bernard doesn't know either. Vivienne called me in February. It was a brief call, and strange in the way that calls are strange when the person making them isn't sure why they're making them but knows they need to. She said she was sorry for the comment about my coat. Specifically that comment. I told her I appreciated it. We haven't spoken since, but the call mattered in its small way because it meant she had looked at what had happened and located herself in it and decided to say something. That's not nothing. Marcus flew in from Vancouver in March. He and Daniel had dinner, just the two of them, for 3 hours. Daniel came home quieter than he'd left, but with a quality of settledness I hadn't seen in him in months. He told me Marcus had decided not to pursue his share of the lake house formally, not because he didn't have the standing, but because he didn't want it. He said he stopped wanting things from that family a long time ago, Daniel told me. He just didn't know it counted as a choice. Marcus is going to be fine, I think. He always was. He just needed the distance confirmed legally. As for where we are now, Daniel and I have been to the lake house twice since January. Once in the spring, just the three of us, when the water was still cold, and Lily insisted on waiting in any way and came out laughing and indignant. Once in late summer with friends, a long weekend with people who had nothing to do with any of this, who grilled on the dock and played cards until midnight and didn't ask questions about whose name was on the deed. Lily is thriving. She started first grade in September and has already, according to her teacher, become the unofficial expert on everything happening in the classroom at any given moment. She asks questions constantly. I have encouraged this. I will continue to encourage it. The 529 account I opened for her has grown quietly since March of last year. Tamaz tells me it's on track. It will be there when she needs it, built on my earnings, in her name, connected to no one else's decisions or assumptions or belief that they knew best. That part was always the point. I don't carry bitterness about Bernard the way I thought I might. He is a man who spent 40 years believing that control and love were the same thing, and who made decisions from inside that belief without ever examining it. That's not an excuse. It's an explanation, and explanations are not the same as forgiveness, but they make the weight easier to set down. What I carry instead is something simpler, the specific memory of Lily at that Christmas table, looking up from her coloring with a question she needed answered, completely unafraid of the asking. She didn't know what she was doing. She was just being herself, curious, direct, unedited by the social calculus that adults spend decades learning. She asked a good question. It turned out to be the right one, so did I go too far, or not far enough? I genuinely want to know what you think.